All right. So forgive me. I want to start off with just a little story, I guess. Yesterday, so we're here in Zurich, Switzerland. Just a 2.5 hour train ride to the actual Davos conference. So yesterday, Linnea Lucan and I and Mark Morano from CFAC decided to go down there and see what we could see if we can ruffle some feathers, anything like that. Really get the full Davos man experience by going down there. Had no idea what to expect, so we went down there figuring that we would see a lot of climate activism sort of things. And it wasn't too long before we found the little climate hub, the little climate pavilion spot, which was kind of a bleak affair. I was surprised that it wasn't like the whole overarching message across the entire Davos was this climate change narrative, because that's seemingly what it's been for the last several years. So we got to this little climate hub, and we walked into where there was a little cafe with a little theater room that was real dark, and they had probably the most boring climate presentation you could ever imagine. I think we stayed in that theater for about 4 minutes before we walked out to see what else we could see. But outside, we noticed this little area where they were cooking sausages, and I was pretty hungry, and I was thinking like those smell pretty good, but they got to be made out of like soy and who knows what, right? Some plant based. I can't believe it's not sausage or something like that. So we walked down. Anyways, when we were coming back from our little adventure in Davos, we stopped there, and Linnea asked the lady that was out in front of this climate hub making these delicious smelling sausages, what are these made out of? And the lady, not, English wasn't her natural language, said, baby cow? I was like, these are veal sausages? We'll have two. So just imagine Linnea and I enjoying a veal sausage in this little area just inside the climate hub. I was just thinking, man, the climate messaging is very off at Davos this year. So I'm sure Linnea can speak to that, but it seems like the bloom is off the rose when it comes to the climate agenda, even at Davos right now. But that's not what I'm up here to talk about. I just thought that was an interesting story. What I am here to talk about, my topic is actually called Socialism is Evil, which I think is the exact right track when you're talking about this sort of rhetoric. So on Monday, I was up here talking about a series of items and issues that I endearingly call 21st century collectivism. I discussed ESG, social credit scores, digital IDs, central bank backed digital currencies. All of these things are tools that aren't necessarily socialism. However, they wield the power necessary to achieve similar collectivist goals. So I believe these items are part and parcel of the overarching Davos agenda and require much attention and criticism going forward. But these emerging issues require new thinking and research, and me and my team spend a lot of time focusing on exactly these sorts of things. However, it is important that we go back to the basics occasionally and hammer down the reemergence of socialism in its more classical form. So, in this presentation, I'm going to make the case that socialism is not only a failed economic system, but more importantly, that socialism is an inherently morally corrupt worldview. So, let's start off with the question of why. Why is it important that we spend this time talking about a failed economic system as opposed to some of the other emerging issues that are going on today? Prior to my center at the Heartland Institute being called the Emerging Issues Center, we were the Socialism Research Center. And despite expanding into a whole host of other topics that we keep tabs on, we still keep our finger on the pulse of socialism, looking for any signs of life. And unfortunately, over the past 12 to 18 months, we have several troubling signs that highlight a resurgence in socialism in the West. And I'm just going to mention just a few. So, at the Emerging Issues Center, we have developed over the years a great relationship with Rasmussen Reports. They are a national polling organization. We regularly commission polls or surveys with Rasmussen to survey the public on a whole host of different issues, including gauging people's support of socialism and other collectivist ideas. Well, I'm displeased to tell you that the approval of socialism has seen a resurgence in these polls ever since we started doing them several years ago. And recently, we have been commissioning polls that focus specifically on younger generations between the ages of 18 and 39. And back in September, our poll results show that a staggering 53% of young voters reported that they would like to see a socialist win the presidency in 2028. Even more alarming, 76% said that they were somewhat or strongly agree that major industries like healthcare, energy, and big tech should be nationalized to give more control and equity to the people. In November, we commissioned another set of polls. And amongst these questions, we again asked likely voters about their preference for a socialist president in 2028. And we got a very similar number with a very important additional piece of information. 42% of those surveyed who identify as conservatives said that they would like to see a democratic socialist win the presidency. 42% of those that said that they were conservatives. Another great data point pointing to the reemergence of socialism was the recent sound victory of the openly socialist Zoran Mamdani becoming mayor of New York City, the world's largest city in the United States. Despite the media's attempt to downplay his socialist beliefs, nearly every action that he's taken shows his worldview. And most recently, Mamdani appointed Sia Weaver as a housing official. Weaver has been giving interviews where she's very clearly advocating for socialist housing in New York City. And I'm not talking about just a housing program for the needy. No, I'm talking about full on socialization of housing in New York City. So here's a direct quote from one of her interviews. What I am envisioning is a world in which the housing is owned by a collective and people are paying 30% of their income in order to live in their housing. If your income is zero, you pay zero. If your income is $500,000 a year, you're paying 30% of that. So there's not much gray area here. This is very openly socialist as you could possibly be. And this belief seems crazy to all of us who understand the virtues of free markets, but there's an old saying, if socialists understood economics, they wouldn't be socialists. And I follow it up and say that if socialists understood history, they wouldn't be socialists. So even if we grant socialists the best possible intentions when it comes to their advocation of socialism, the historical track record of this failed economic system could not be more clear. Despite having been attempted on every continent in a variety of different cultures and eras, socialism has failed spectacularly. In fact, it has led to chaos, bloodshed, and tyranny on an unprecedented scale. More than 167 million people have been killed, imprisoned, or exiled by socialist and communist parties over the past 120 years. So the track record is absolutely clear. We at the Heartland Institute have produced a bunch of material on this, chronicling the abhorrent history of socialism. We have the book Socialism is Evil, written by New York Times bestselling author and Heartland Vice President of Policy Justin Haskins. We have also recently produced Socialism at a Glance, which covers several case studies of socialism running its course through various countries across the planet. Justin Haskins and I have also worked with Glenn Beck on his 2020 New York Times bestselling book, Arguing with Socialists. And I'll tell you, from my experience combing through the history of socialism, you start to notice certain patterns that emerge that point to larger truths when it comes to collectivist regimes. So the first one I'll mention is the drive to change human nature. So perhaps the most critical flaw in Marx's socialism is the assumption that it is possible to convince virtually everyone to abandon their natural tendency to embrace competition and ambition. This is a core part of socialism. Socialists frame competition as a fruit of the greedy ruling class leaders' schemes and not the result of human nature. According to socialists, we compete because we believe we must. We compete because the people in charge have basically came up with a way to trick us into competing and that we don't have to. There's a better way. This view is proven false by virtually every aspect of the human experience. From the time children first begin to interact with each other to the moment we die, all humans experience and embrace some form of competition, even when they don't need to. For socialist regimes to break through this, they must first attempt to change human nature. You see this time and time again. In the Soviet Union, Stalin commissioned officials with the task of using psychological conditioning to create the Soviet new man. In Cambodia, Pol Pot sought to create a Cambodian master race using social engineering. In China, Mao followed in Stalin's footsteps, believing Pavlovian conditioning could help make the Chinese people act in ways desired by the ruling regime. There are several other examples of this throughout history. I'm just trying to name a few. But time and time again, when the public doesn't conform to the ideology of the socialists, the regime deem it necessary to change human nature as opposed to just the acknowledgement that socialism is incongruent with human nature. Which brings me to my next pattern. You see this throughout socialist history, and that is the idea of doubling down in the face of failure. The population doesn't act according to socialist dogma, engineer a new population that does. And if a socialist program fails to achieve its goal, that isn't a reflection on whether or not that program was good in the first place. We just need to push harder and harder for that success. And oftentimes that means increased authoritarianism. In 1956, the Chinese government under Mao Zedong claimed to want to increase the freedom of speech, inviting criticism of the Communist Party under a campaign called the 100 Flowers. The idea of this was to let 100 flowers bloom and 100 schools of thought contend. Sounds great, right? You may not have even heard about this. The idea that the communist Mao regime was advocating for free speech. Well, the reason you haven't heard about it is because it didn't last very long. Eventually, the communist regime in China grew tired of criticism, ended the campaign, and started throwing their political opponents in prison and forced labor camps. This sort of thing is standard throughout socialist regimes. Sometimes this pattern takes a very weird track too, and unexpected turns. My favorite example of this is the rabbit plan in Venezuela. So, as socialism took hold in Venezuela, of course, food shortages and hunger followed. So, in response, did Nicolas Maduro reestablish market principles? No, of course not. Instead, the regime instituted the so called rabbit plan, which encouraged citizens to raise and breed rabbits for their animal protein. The government actually began to provide communities with baby bunnies that they could raise, breed, and eventually eat. The program was then beset by a new problem. People in Venezuela started to treat the animals like pets. They started giving them names, they started dressing them up, they started treating them like they were part of the family. So you might think, well, the government would say, oh, well, that was a bad idea. Maybe we should try something else. No, of course not. They double down. Instead, the Minister of Urban Agriculture suggested an educational campaign to make the rabbit plan effective. To rectify the problem, the minister said, quote, we need a publicity campaign on radio, TV, in newspapers, in cartoons, everywhere, so that the people understand that rabbits aren't pets, but instead 2.5 kilos of meat. So at the beginning, you would never have thought that a food program would require a countrywide propaganda campaign to convince people to eat their pets. But there you have it. Another pattern is the need to scapegoat groups of people when the goals of the regime fail. Oftentimes, the regime will label people as saboteurs. It's not possible that our ideas are flawed and will inevitably lead to disaster. It must be that we are a victim of sabotage and that those responsible must be held accountable. This pattern is the one that leads most directly to overt repression and the savagery that we've seen in failing totalitarian regimes across the world. But as I discussed in the beginning of my talk on Monday, the greatest economic flaw of the socialist worldview is the attempt to centralize economic decision making, replacing the combined will of millions of individuals with the demands of a central authority. Regardless of how much power an authoritarian regime takes, it cannot possibly replace basic core economic concepts like price signals, price equilibrium, supply and demand, and basic voluntary markets of exchange. It just cannot do that. But here's the mistake that we often find ourselves on the free market advocate side of this debate. We stop there. We say that socialism doesn't work, and then we think that settles the issue. For a lot of young people today, it doesn't, because they're not looking for a system that works most efficiently. They're looking for a system that feels fair. And to many, this debate is a morality issue. And that is why I think it's important not only to explain why socialism fails, but why it is inherently morally corrupt. So this is where I want to kind of slow down a little bit because I feel like this is the part of the debate that isn't had as often as some of the other things that I've talked about. When it comes to the track record of socialism, the evil outcomes are very clear. Whether it's the result of socialist policy induced food shortages causing mass starvation, or the intentional starvation of specific populations, or regimes explicitly murdering political dissidents, the human carnage is off the charts. 65 million in China, 20 to 30 million in the Soviet Union, 15 to 20 million in Nazi Germany, 1 to 3 million in North Korea, 2 million in Cambodia, 1.6 million in Vietnam, 400,000 in Romania, 100,000 in Cuba, and on it goes. So you would think these numbers alone would cause people to rethink their support for socialism, and in many it does. But there is another problem out there, and that's the idea that students simply are not taught these things in schools. They're talked about the virtues of a what is it, a collaborative economic model that's a mixed economy, I think is what they call it. But for many, there is a hubris, and this is the problem. There's a hubris that this time it can be different, or worse. If I was in charge of tomorrow's socialist regime, I would be benevolent, unlike all those monsters of history. So we have to bypass these responses and explain the moral failures of socialism up front. The first moral failure of socialism, and I think that this is a foundational one, is this. When the government managed everything, everything becomes political. Now, this might sound obvious at first, but the implications are enormous. In a free society, there are wide areas of life that are deliberately kept outside of politics. This include your job, your purchases, your lifestyle choices, your moral beliefs. All of these things we consider personal. Most of these things are worked out voluntarily between individuals, families, churches, communities, and markets. Under socialism, that private space disappears. When the state owns or controls the major sectors of society, every decision becomes a collective decision. And collective decisions are, by definition, political decisions. There is no longer a meaningful private sphere. There is no longer a place where you can say, well, that's my responsibility, it's my choice, so it's my risk, so leave me alone. That disappears. Instead, every choice you make is subject to public debate, public pressure, and eventually public enforcement. And this is where socialism becomes something more dangerous than just an efficient economic model. Because once everything is political, moral disagreement becomes political conflict. If you and I disagree in a free society, we can go our separate ways. We can choose our own services and goods we want to buy. We can decide to live in different communities. But in a socialist collective society, there is no going your separate ways. If the state manages healthcare, housing, energy, education, transportation, then disagreement isn't just disagreement anymore. It's a fight over who controls the system. And that means politics invades every part of our life. Your values, priorities, your behavior all become subject to public approval. That's why socialism cannot tolerate moral pluralism for very long. Socialism requires consensus. And when consensus doesn't emerge voluntarily, it has to be enforced, which brings us to the simple but unsettling truth. There is no neutral ground in a fully collectivized society. You are either aligned with the collective decisions or you are standing in the way of them. And once that line is crossed, the system no longer treats you as an individual with a conscience, but a problem that needs to be managed. That is the logic of socialism working exactly as intended. So let's talk about how this applies to healthcare, because healthcare is one of the most commonly defended socialist proposals, the idea of socializing healthcare. When healthcare is fully socialized, the argument goes like this: everyone pays in and everyone benefits. Sounds compassionate, sounds fair. But when the part that rarely gets mentioned is that when costs are socialized, behavior becomes a public concern. Your health is no longer just your responsibility. It's everybody's responsibility. Your choices are no longer just your business. They're everybody's business. Your risks are no longer yours to bear because now everyone is paying for them. And once that happens, the public begins to claim moral authority over your behavior. Whether it's the diet, if you choose a diet that's considered unhealthy, whether or not you exercise vigorously, whether or not you smoke multiple cigars, James Taylor, whether or not you have your occasional drink, it all is a burden that has to be bared by the rest of the collective. So it's no longer just your body that you're inflicting any potential damage on. What begins as free healthcare quietly becomes a social permission structure. This is the logical outcome of shifting responsibility away from the individual into the collective. At that point, the question shifts from, is this your choice, to, should the rest of us be forced to pay for it? And once that question is accepted, enforcement is never far behind. This is how socialism transforms personal responsibility into public regulation. What began as a proposal to pool resources turns into the necessity to pool moral judgment. And the principle underneath all of this is simple. If everyone pays, everyone gets a vote and eventually a veto. And that veto doesn't just apply to policy, it applies to you and your lifestyle, and it applies to your personal autonomy. This is control justified by collective obligation. And it is one of the clearest examples of how socialism converts private responsibility into public enforcement. And once socialism has erased the private sphere, and once it has turned personal responsibility into public enforcement, there is one final moral consequence that follows. Collective ownership means collective moral responsibility. This is the part of socialism that almost never gets talked about, but it is probably the most dangerous of all. In a free society, if you believe something is wrong, you can refuse to participate in it. You can opt out, withhold your support. You could say, I don't want this in my name. Socialism does not allow for this. Under socialism, participation is mandatory. So let me give you a fairly simple example. Imagine a vegan who believes that it is morally repugnant to kill animals. Not talking about just a preference or something. We're talking about like a deeply held moral conviction. In a socialist system where agriculture is collectively owned, that person is now part owner of a slaughterhouse. They may object and protest and vote against it, but at the end of the day, they are still directly morally entangled in something they believe fundamentally is wrong. Their opposition doesn't absolve them. Their conscience doesn't exempt them, because collective ownership means shared responsibility, whether you consent to that or you don't. And once you see that, the problem becomes impossible to ignore. And this doesn't just apply to agriculture or food or whether or not you think meat should be a part of everyone's diet. This applies to essentially everything. Under socialism, you don't get to just say, I disagree, so I won't participate. Your labor funds it, your taxes support it, your name as a member of the collective is attached to it. And that is the profound moral violation, because conscience only has meaning if it allows refusal. A system that denies moral exit reorders morality itself. It tells you that your deepest convictions are subordinate to whatever the collective decides at any given moment. And once that line is crossed, freedom no longer exists in any meaningful sense. Freedom is the ability to say no, and socialism removes that right entirely. You are no longer to say, not in my name. At this point, the system claims ownership over your conscience. So let me close with this. The real divide here is not compassion versus cruelty. It's not fairness versus greed. It is freedom versus the collective. A free society does not require us to agree on everything. We can have moral disagreement. We have voluntary association. A free society allows people to live according to their conscience, to choose, to refuse, and to walk away if we feel necessary. This is the great strength of a free society. Socialism cannot tolerate that kind of pluralism. It demands unity at the cost of liberty, It demands participation at the cost of conscience. And once a system reaches the point where moral dissent is treated as a threat, freedom utterly collapses. So, this is why socialism is not merely just a flawed and inefficient economic system. It's a system that cannot tolerate moral dissent. And that means it's dangerous. And yes, at its roots, that means it is evil. Thank you.